Born in a brothel and sold before she could walk, a Lakota chief was the first to stay. I am going to tell you something I have not told anyone, not my sons, not the council, not the medicine man who has known me since before I knew myself. I am going to tell you about the woman. Not because I am old enough now that it doesn't matter. I'm not sure any man ever gets old enough for that. But because there is a truth in it that I think a man ought to say out loud at least once before he goes. And because the story starts with a rope, and it ends with her hand in mine, and everything in between is the reason I am still here. Start with the rope. The year was, it doesn't matter the year. What matters is that the drought had come for the third season running, and the creek that fed the lower pasture had gone to cracked mud. 3 of my best horses had died from something wrong in the grass, a sickness none of us could name. My youngest son had gone to work for the railroad and hadn't come back. My eldest had married a woman from the Crow Nation and moved north with her people, and I did not begrudge him that. She was a good woman and he was happy, but the going was still a going. And my wife, Pale Moon. She had been sick 2 winters, not dramatically sick, not the way sickness comes in stories, sudden and swift and then done. She went slowly, the way a fire goes when there's no more wood but the embers are still there and you keep looking at them hoping. I sat with her most nights near the end. I held her hand and she held mine, and one morning I woke up from a short sleep, and her hand was still in mine, but it was not holding back anymore. After that I did what men do. I worked. I managed the land. I spoke when the council needed speaking to, and I was heard because I had always been heard, and the words came out right because they always did, and none of it meant anything. I had spent 30 years building something with that woman, and now the something was just structure. Posts and wire and packed earth, sound without resonance. The rope was in the barn. I want to be honest about that. I had not decided anything. I want to be clear about that. But there are certain nights when a man goes into the barn and stands there with his lantern and looks at the rafters and thinks certain thoughts that he does not name, and that was where I was. That is the honest truth. I don't know how long I stood there. The horse in the nearest stall, an old gray I'd had 14 years, was watching me. Animals know. She knew. She was watching me the way horses watch when something isn't right, very still, ears forward, just watching. And then I heard the wagon. I didn't go out right away. You don't, when you're standing in a barn in the dark having unnamed thoughts. I put the lantern on the post and I stood and I listened, and what I heard was one horse, one set of wheels, slow, not someone in a hurry, not someone running, but not someone who knew where they were going either. They stopped at the edge of the yard. I came out. She was on the bench of a wagon that had seen better country. The horse pulling it was a dun mare with a cut on her left foreleg, not bad but not tended to either. The woman on the bench was, I couldn't see her clearly. Lantern light only. She was watching me come across the yard and her hands were not on the reins anymore. She put the reins down. That's the first thing I noticed. A woman alone at a strange man's homestead in the dark, and she'd put the reins down. She said in Lakota, which was not what I expected, though I should have, given how she looked, she said, I am looking for Iron Hand's place. They told me in the last town. I said I was Iron Hand. She looked at me a long moment, then she said, they said you might have work. I said, who told you that? She said a name, a man from the settlement who had owed me a good turn and apparently paid it in a direction I hadn't anticipated. Then she said, and I remember this exactly because of how she said it, plain as stone, she said, I am not asking for charity. I can work. I am asking to be paid for it. I stood there a moment, then I said, your mare has a cut. She looked at the horse. She said, I know, I need to clean it. I said, come inside and I'll heat water. She said, the horse first. I looked at her another moment. Then I said, yes, the horse first. Her name was Nora, not a Lakota name, a name given to her by the woman who'd bought her when she was 2 years old from Well. I'll get to that. She kept the name because it was the only name she'd ever answered to. She'd picked up Lakota from the family that kept her, French from the traders she'd cooked and cleaned for in her teens, and English good enough to do business in. She was 34 years old, and she had the kind of face that has lived in weather not hard but settled. Like a good piece of stone that's been in a riverbed long enough that the water has just made it what it was always going to be. I found out the rest over time. Born in a house of women in a settlement I won't name on the Missouri. Her mother was a Métis woman, her father unknown. The woman who ran the house sold her. I will say that plainly. She was sold to a Lakota family when she was 2. Not sold cruelly in the way of that time and place. It was considered a decent arrangement. The family wanted a girl child, and her mother had nothing, and the money was real. Whether it was decent or not, I am not the one to judge. What I know is what Nora told me, and what she told me was that the family was not unkind. She worked hard, she was fed, she was never beaten, but she also never belonged, not the way a child belongs. She was always slightly outside, slightly held at arm's length, always more useful than loved. When the family's eldest son was grown and wanted to marry, the arrangement was renegotiated, and Nora was sent away with a horse and 3 weeks of food, and the vague understanding that she was now responsible for herself. She was 17. By the time she came to my yard, she had been responsible for herself for 17 more years. She'd cooked for a mining camp. She'd kept house for a French trader's family for 4 years until the wife took sick of jealousy over nothing and let her go. She'd done laundry, mended saddles, broken horses, hauled wood, done whatever work presented itself, and done it until it was done, and then found the next thing. She had not had in those 17 years a place she could call her own. Not a room. Not a corner. Not a place where she could put a thing down and be sure it would be there in the morning. That was what she was looking for, not rescue. I want to be clear about that. I don't think Nora ever looked for rescue in her life. She was looking for solid ground. I gave her the room off the kitchen. It had been used for storage. We moved the grain sacks out, and I put a decent bed in, and she cleaned the rest herself. She didn't ask me to help, and I didn't offer. By the second morning, she had it the way she wanted it. She worked. God, she worked. Not to impress me. I don't think she was even thinking about me in those first weeks. She was working because the work was there, and she was the kind of person who looks at work and then does it. The garden, which I had let go to ruin since Pale Moon died, she sorted in 2 weeks. Not the way it had been. She did it her own way. Different rows, different logic, but it worked. And by midsummer we had more green things than I'd had in 3 years. She fixed the fencing on the lower pasture without being asked. She re-roofed the storage shed herself, got up on it one morning when I was out with the horses, and by the time I came back she was most of the way done. I asked her that evening if she'd ever done roofing before. She said, "I watched a man do it once. It didn't look complicated." I said, "It isn't." We looked at each other across the supper table, and she almost smiled. Nora's almost smile, I came to know it well. The corners of her mouth would move, and something would shift in her eyes, and then she'd look back at her food. As if the smile were a thing she was still deciding whether to spend. I was not thinking about her the way a man thinks about a woman. I want to say that because it's true. I was thinking about her the way I thought about the land or the horses, with attention, with a kind of respect for what a thing actually was as opposed to what you expected it to be. She was simply the most capable person on my land, and I noticed it the way you notice when something works the way it's supposed to. The ranch came back to life. That's not a small thing to say. I had let it go, quietly, without meaning to. Not dramatically, not in one season, just the way a man lets things go when the heart isn't in it. A fence not mended, a field not turned, things that could wait, waiting. And now they weren't waiting. Nora didn't know she was doing it, she was just working. But the side effect of her work was that I started working again too, because it was harder not to when someone beside you was at it. And one morning I was out at first light without having decided to be, and I realized I was hungry for the day. I stood there in the cold air of that early morning with that realization, and it felt strange. Not bad, just strange. Like a sensation you'd forgotten you could have. I told you the rope was in the barn. I went back in there maybe a month after she'd come, and I stood in the same spot, same lantern on the same post, and I looked at the rafters, and the thought I'd had before, it wasn't there. Not in any urgent way. It was like a scar you can still find if you look for it, but it doesn't pull anymore. I stood there for a while. Then I took the rope and coiled it and hung it on the proper hook and went back to the house. She was up. She heard me come in. She slept light, always had. Years of being the one who had to be alert will do that. And she was at the table with a cup of something and her hair down, which I hadn't seen before. She wore it in 2 braids mostly. Down, it was long and dark and had a slight wave to it. She looked at me. She said, "You couldn't sleep either." I sat down across from her. I said, "I sleep fine." She gave me the almost smile. We didn't say anything for a while. She was looking at her cup. I was looking at the table. Outside, the wind was doing something in the cottonwoods, that dry rattling sound they make in late summer. She said without looking up, "This is a good place." I said it was. "It's getting back to it." She looked up then. She said, "It is back to it. You just don't see it yet because you're still looking at what it was." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what to say. She said, "Pale Moon, the woman you lost." It wasn't a question. She'd heard me say the name in my sleep. She'd never mentioned it. "You're still waiting to be allowed to have something again." I looked at her. She looked back. She had a way of looking at you, not hard, not aggressive, just direct, the way a Clearwater Creek is direct about where it's going. She didn't drop her eyes and she didn't soften it. She just looked at me like she was saying a plain truth and I could do with it what I wanted. I said, "You don't know me well enough to say that." She said, "Maybe not, but I know what someone looks like when they're managing their life instead of living it." She looked back at her cup. I looked like that for a long time. I didn't sleep that night. Not in a bad way. In the way you don't sleep when something has shifted and you're still getting your footing. I thought about Pale Moon. I always thought about Pale Moon. But for the first time I thought about her without the specific grief of a man who believes his best time is behind him. I thought about her the way you think about something true, something that happened and was real and mattered, but not as the ceiling, not as the last good thing. I thought about Nora putting the reins down. A woman arriving alone in the dark at a strange man's place and putting the reins down. Not because she was careless, because she decided, in whatever calculation she'd run before she even stopped the wagon, that she wasn't going to need them to run. I didn't know if she decided that about me specifically, or about the situation, or about something else entirely. But I had been around horses and men long enough to know that the putting down of reins is not an accident. She had chosen to arrive without an exit. I thought about that for a long time. In September, a man came to the ranch. He was looking for Nora. Not a dangerous man, not openly. He was smooth, well-dressed for the territory, a trader of some kind out of the settlement on the river. He knew her name, knew her history, knew things about her that made me go very still and quiet inside in the way I go still when I am deciding something. He wanted her to come back with him. He had papers, some kind of indenture arrangement from years back that he claimed was still valid, which I doubted and which Nora, standing behind me on the porch, clearly doubted also, but which he was confident enough in to have ridden 3 days to present. I looked at the papers. I handed them back. I said, "She works for me. She is paid for her work. She is not party to anything you're holding." He said, "That might be a question for a judge." I said, "It might be. You're welcome to find one." There was a pause. He was looking at me, calculating. I have been looked at like that many times in my life. I have been chief of my band since I was 31 years old, and before that I was a warrior, and before that I was the son of a warrior, and I know what a man looks like when he is deciding whether the thing he wants is worth the cost of the man between him and it. I let him look. I didn't move and I didn't speak. He left. Nora stood beside me, and we watched the dust of him go. She said after a while, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "He'll probably come back with someone." I said, "Probably." She said, "I've been dealing with men like him since I was 17. I said, "I know." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I'm tired of dealing with men like him." I said, "You don't have to anymore. Not on this land." She looked at me. The afternoon light was coming in low and hard, and it caught the side of her face, and she was looking at me the way she'd looked at me that night at the table, direct, without armor, just the plain truth of a person looking at another person. She said, "You mean that?" I said, "Yes." She looked away. She looked at the dust trail of the man who was gone. She said, quiet, "I've heard that before." I said, "I know you have. I'm not asking you to believe it because I said it. I'm asking you to stay long enough to see if it's true." A long moment, then she said, "I wasn't planning on leaving." October. The first cold came early, which it does some years, and we got the cattle to the lower pasture, and sealed the north-facing gaps in the barn wall and brought in enough wood to last through February. She was beside me for all of it. Not because I asked her. She was there because the work needed doing, and she was the kind of person who does the work. There was an evening, the wood was stacked and the air had that first snow smell that isn't quite snow yet dry and cold and sharp, and we were standing at the edge of the yard looking at the mountains. She had her arms crossed against the cold. I had my coat on. We weren't saying anything. She leaned against my shoulder, not dramatically, just leaned. The way you lean against something solid when you've been standing a long time, and you finally stop thinking about standing. I felt it all the way through me, the weight of her, slight as it was, the warmth. I didn't say anything. I put my arm around her, her shoulders against my side, and she let me, and we stood there watching the light go out of the mountains. That was when I knew. Not love, not yet. That word takes longer, that word requires more than one evening. But I knew she wasn't going anywhere. Not because she had nowhere to go. Not because she was grateful or afraid or without options. She had options. She was Nora. She'd been managing options since she was 17. She was choosing this. She was choosing me. I don't know if you know what that means to a man who has spent 4 years telling himself his choosing days were done. A man who had been a chief, who had led warriors, who had built something in the earth and put his name on it, who had loved and been loved, and then watched that love go and quietly concluded there would be no more. I don't know if you know what it means to that man to feel a woman choose to lean against him. Not because she needs saving. Because she decided he was worth leaning on. Winter. She was sick in January. A fever, it came on fast, 2 days of nothing and then sudden, the way fevers go. I sat with her. I knew how to sit with sick people. I had practice I wished I didn't have. I made the teas pale Moon's mother had taught me. I changed the cloths on her head. I talked to her when she was half awake because she said once, eyes half open, voice like paper, "Keep talking. I keep losing the thread." So I talked. I talked about the land. I talked about my sons. I talked about the horses and the spring planting and the creek that might run clear again this year if the snowpack held. I talked about my father, who I hadn't talked about to anyone in 20 years. I talked about the first time I led men in a fight and how afraid I was, not of dying but of failing them, and how that fear never entirely left. I talked about Pale Moon. I told Nora about Pale Moon, the whole truth of her, not the grief version but the real version, what she laughed like and what she argued like and what she looked like in the morning. Nora listened. When she was too tired to keep her eyes open, she kept listening. I could tell. On the third night the fever broke. She lay there quiet for a long time afterward, the color coming back into her face, her breathing evening out. I was still in the chair beside her. I'd been in that chair for 3 days more or less. She said soft, "You stayed." I said, "Of course." She said, "Don't say of course. Nobody stays." A pause. "Not with me, I'm not." She stopped, closed her eyes, opened them again. "I'm not the kind of person people stay for." I looked at her. I said, "You are the kind of person I stay for." She looked at me. In the lamplight her eyes were dark and wet and very clear, not crying, just open in a way I hadn't seen before. She'd lowered something. Whatever she'd been keeping up. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you put the reins down." She looked at me for a long time. Then she reached out and took my hand. Not gently, firmly, the way you hold something you mean to hold. I held on. Spring. The creek did run clear. I was right about the snowpack. The lower pasture came back, greener than it had been in 5 years. She planted the garden differently again. I had stopped even trying to predict what she'd do with it, and now I just watched and was usually impressed. She had a way with growing things that I came to believe had something to do with the fact that she understood what it meant to need specific conditions to be what you were supposed to be. My eldest son came to visit in May with his wife and their new daughter. He had not met Nora. I had not told him much, only that there was someone, and he came ready to form his opinion. He formed it in about half a day. I saw him watching her. The way she worked, the way she spoke, the way she handled his wife, who was quiet with strangers. Nora read her right and gave her space, and by the second day they were talking in the garden and laughing about something I couldn't hear. The evening before he left, my son sat beside me and said, "She's not what I expected." I said, "What did you expect?" He said, "I don't know, someone who needed things from you." I said, "She doesn't need things from me." He said, "I know, that's what I mean." He looked at me. "She stays because she wants to." I said, "Yes." He was quiet a moment, then he said, "Good. You needed someone who would stay because they wanted to." We didn't say anything else about it. Men in my family don't, usually. But he put his hand on my shoulder when he left, a firm grip, brief, and there was something in it that I recognized as a kind of returning, as if he'd been waiting to see that I was still the man he'd known, and now he'd seen it and was satisfied. Midsummer. There is an evening I keep in my mind the way you keep certain things. Not framed, not preserved, just there, available, a thing I can go back to. We were sitting outside after supper. She was repairing a bridle. She did that in the evening sometimes, small leather work, her hands very certain and quick. The light was the kind of light you get in midsummer when the sun is going, but hasn't gone yet, and everything turns that particular color that doesn't have a name. Copper and gold and something older than both. She had her hair loose. She'd started doing that in the evenings, not for me, I don't think, just because she was somewhere she felt she could. She looked up at me. She said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "You." She looked at me the way she looks at me sometimes. That thing in her eyes that is not quite a smile and not quite something else, just a direct and open warmth, like looking at a clear sky and knowing the weather is settled. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you? You still look at me, sometimes like you're waiting." I thought about that. I said, "Old habit." She set the bridle down. She moved her chair beside mine and sat down close, her shoulder against my arm, her hands in her lap now, quiet. She put her head against my shoulder, that same lean from October, but slower now, more deliberate. The practiced weight of someone who has learned that the thing will hold. I put my arm around her. The mountains were going dark across the ridge. The horses were settling in the corral, that low shuffling sound they make. The cottonwoods were doing nothing for once, no wind, just standing in the last light. I thought about the barn, the rope, the unnamed night. I thought about her wagon coming out of the dark, the reins laid down. I thought about 30 years of building something, and then standing in the wreckage of it, and believing the building was done. I had been wrong. I put my face down against her hair. She smelled like the outside dust and sun and something green. She made a small sound, not quite a word, and settled closer. I thought, this woman came to my land with nothing but herself, and she chose to stay. She chose me. Not because she was broken and I was whole. She was as whole as a person gets, maybe more whole than I was, but because she looked at what was here and decided it was worth her staying for. I had given her solid ground. She had given me a reason to stand on it. She asked me once, maybe a year after she'd come, what I thought of her, the whole truth of her, the beginning of her, the brothel and the selling and all of it. She asked it plainly, the way Nora asks things, looking at me without armor, with the particular courage of a person who has learned that most things they feared people would use against them were not actually as weaponizable as they'd thought. I said, I think you are the most self-made person I have ever known. She looked at me a long time, then she said, that's a strange thing to say. I said, most people are made by the things that happen to them, good things or bad. You looked at what happened to you, and you decided to be made by yourself instead. She looked at me a long time. Something moved in her face. She said, nobody has ever said anything like that to me. I said, then they weren't paying attention. She laughed. A real laugh, not the almost smile. A full, surprised, genuine laugh that I had only heard a few times before, and each time it felt like finding water in dry country. She covered her mouth with her hand, and then she didn't cover her mouth, and the laugh went on a little longer, and then she looked at me with bright, wet eyes and shook her head. She reached over and took my face in both her hands, held it. The way you hold something you want to see clearly, really clearly, without any of the usual distance. She said, you see me. I said, yes. She said, you really do. I said, I always did. I am telling you this for a reason. I was standing in a barn with unnamed thoughts. I was a man who had used up what he thought he was given, a chief without the thing that had made the chiefhood worth anything. A man with land and standing and horses and nothing he wanted to wake up for. And then a woman arrived in the dark and put her reins down. That woman had been sold before she could walk. She had been sent away at 17 with a horse and 3 weeks of food. She had spent 34 years being useful without being loved, and she had built out of those years something that most people who'd had everything she hadn't couldn't match. She came to my land and she worked and she looked at me clearly and she said plain truths and she stayed. Not because I asked her to. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Because she chose to. I am a Lakota man. I have led warriors. I have sat in council with men who knew the land before the iron rails and the settlers and the slow diminishing of everything we'd known. I have been respected. I have been feared. I have been obeyed. I have had many things in my life that a man can point to. What I am telling you is that the best thing, the thing that I will carry into whatever comes after this, is the evening when a woman who had never had solid ground leaned against my shoulder, and I put my arm around her, and she let out a long, slow breath like she'd been holding it for 20 years. She was the one who stayed. But she's the one who saved me. I think she knows it. I think she knew it before I did. The creek runs clear this year. The horses are well. The garden is something else entirely. She's put in things I don't have names for and they're growing. The mountains are standing in the evening light the way they've always stood, and the cottonwoods are doing what cottonwoods do, and Nora is on the porch, her hair loose in the last of the sun, and she is looking out at the land with the expression she gets when she is satisfied with a thing. I am going to go sit beside her. That is the whole story. That is everything.